It was one of those extravagant evenings where the wealthy flaunted their status and rubbed shoulders with the elite. The Anderson mansion gleamed under the chandeliers, its halls filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of whispered conversations. Henry Anderson, the millionaire patriarch, played the perfect host. He was a man who had built his fortune through shrewd business deals and relentless ambition, and tonight, the who's who of the city gathered to celebrate his latest success. But the real power behind the image wasn't Henry. It was his wife, Clarissa Anderson, a woman known for her striking beauty, sharp tongue, and even sharper disdain for those she deemed beneath her. Clarissa drifted through the grand hall, her presence commanding attention. Dressed in a luxurious gown that shimmered with every step, she smiled at the guests, though there was always something cold and calculating behind her eyes. She was used to being admired, feared even. After all, in her world, wealth and power were everything. But Clarissa's charm was a weapon, one she wielded against anyone who dared cross her or didn't meet her exacting standards. In the background, moving almost invisibly between the guests, was Marta. She wore the uniform of a humble maid, simple, unassuming, and designed to make her blend into the surroundings. But Marta was no ordinary maid. Unbeknownst to everyone, including Clarissa, Marta was the daughter of an equally wealthy and influential family. Her father had arranged for her to marry the Anderson son, a union that would continue the long-standing tradition between the two powerful families. Marta, however, had not agreed to this lightly. Her father had taught her from a young age that true honor and character were revealed in how one treated those with less power. Therefore, before she could accept this marriage, she had set a condition. She needed to know the true nature of the Anderson family. Her father had raised her to value dignity above all else, regardless of status or wealth. So, in secret, Marta had taken up the role of a maid in the Anderson household. She wanted to observe them up close, without the mask of wealth and power. Only by seeing how they treated the most vulnerable in their household would she decide whether they were worthy of her respect and ultimately of her hand in marriage. The evening had progressed smoothly, with the rich and powerful mingling, sipping fine champagne and exchanging pleasantries. That was until Marta made a small mistake. She had been carefully carrying a tray of crystal glasses filled with drinks when, in a moment of distraction, one of the glasses tipped over, splashing its contents on the edge of a white silk tablecloth. It was a minor incident, something that could have been easily resolved with a cloth and a quiet apology. But Clarissa, standing nearby, had noticed. Her eyes flashed with fury as she marched over, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The room seemed to hush as Clarissa's voice cut through the air. "You clumsy fool," she snapped, loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. "Can you not do the one simple task you were hired for?" Her tone was biting, filled with contempt, and the guests who overheard the exchange shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Marta, though used to observing others, had not expected such a harsh reaction. She stood still, her face flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't say a word. Her heart pounded in her chest, but years of discipline and restraint kept her from responding. She knew this moment would come, but it still stung. She had seen Clarissa's type before. Those who believed their wealth gave them the right to treat others as less than human. What Clarissa didn't know, however, was that she was humiliating the very woman her son was destined to marry. The guests exchanged glances, some horrified by the public display of cruelty, but none dared to intervene. After all, Clarissa Anderson was a force to be reckoned with, and few would risk her wrath for the sake of a mere maid. But Marta stood her ground, refusing to shrink under the weight of Clarissa's scorn. Clarissa wasn't finished. She pointed to the stain on the tablecloth, as if it were a catastrophic disaster. "This is an event for important people," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "People who actually matter. Not like you. You're just a servant. Clean this mess up immediately, and then get out of my sight." The words hit Marta like a slap, but it wasn't the insult itself that stung. It was a realization that this woman, the one her father had promised her to, was the very embodiment of everything Marta despised. Her father had taught her that the true measure of a person was in how they treated those with less. And here was Clarissa, who wielded her wealth like a weapon, using it to crush anyone she deemed inferior. Marta bent down to clean the spill, her movements slow and deliberate. She felt the weight of the room's eyes on her, but she refused to let it break her composure. As she wiped the tablecloth, she thought of her father's words, of the promise she had made to herself. If the Anderson family could not meet the standard of honor and respect she had grown up with, she would walk away from the arrangement. It didn't matter how much money or power they had. What mattered was their character. And tonight, Clarissa had shown her true colors. The room remained eerily quiet after Clarissa's outburst. Guests resumed their conversations in hushed tones, clearly unsettled by the spectacle they had just witnessed. Some looked at Marta with pity, while others glanced at Clarissa with disapproval, though none dared say anything aloud. The facade of polite society was too fragile, too easily shattered by a moment of truth. Then, just as Marta was finishing up, the door to the grand hall opened and a new figure entered the room. It was Richard, a prominent businessman and close friend of Marta's father. He was not supposed to attend the event, but his arrival now seemed almost fated. His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Marta, his expression changed from casual indifference to sharp recognition. Without hesitation, he crossed the room to greet her. "Marta," he said, loud enough for several guests to hear. "It's been a long time. How are you, my dear?" At that moment, everything shifted. The guests who had witnessed Marta's humiliation now looked at her in a new light, whispering among themselves. Clarissa froze, her eyes widening in shock. She had no idea who Marta really was, and now, her cruel words hung in the air like a noose tightening around her own neck. Richard's arrival had thrown everything into disarray, and within moments, it became clear to everyone present that Marta was not just a maid. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the city, and the future bride of Clarissa's own son. A minute ago, Clarissa had felt powerful, towering over Marta with her insults. Now, she was the one shrinking under the weight of her own arrogance. The room had turned against her in an instant, and the look of horror on her face said everything. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The atmosphere in the Anderson mansion had shifted drastically after the events of that fateful evening. Word of what had happened between Clarissa and Marta spread like wildfire among the city's elite. But while Clarissa remained seething, trying to regain her lost control, Marta maintained a quiet composure. She had prepared for moments like these, knowing that her true identity would eventually come to light. The humiliation had not broken her. If anything, it had strengthened her resolve. Now, the time had come for her past to begin unfolding, piece by piece, not just to the Anderson family, but to everyone watching closely. In the days that followed the confrontation, whispers filled every corner of the mansion. The servants, who had always been wary of Clarissa's sharp tongue and cruel ways, began to exchange furtive glances whenever she walked by. They had always known something was different about Marta, the way she carried herself, her quiet dignity, even under pressure. But none had suspected she was from such a prestigious background. The realization left many in awe, though few dared speak openly about it. They knew better than to cross Clarissa, who was in a state of silent fury. Marta, on the other hand, had not come to the mansion for recognition or to prove a point. She was here because she had made a promise, not just to her father, but to herself. Her upbringing had instilled in her a sense of duty and honor that went beyond the superficial glamour of wealth. Her family, the Duvalier, were known not only for their riches but for their integrity. Unlike many of the nouveau riche families in the city, the Duvalier had built their empire over generations, with a firm belief that true power came from treating others with respect and fairness, no matter their station in life. Her father, Jean Duvalier, had always been a man of principles, a towering figure in the world of international business. Jean had earned the respect of his peers not only for his financial acumen, but for his kindness and sense of justice. He had raised Marta with the same values. teaching her that true wealth came from the character of a person, not the amount of money in their bank account. It was these values that made Marta question the arranged marriage her father had proposed with the Anderson family. She had known of their fortune, of course, but their reputation for arrogance, particularly that of Clarissa, had always given her pause. When her father first approached her about the marriage, Marta had been hesitant. It wasn't that she didn't understand the importance of family alliances in their world. She did. But she had seen too many marriages of convenience fall apart because they were built on nothing but mutual financial gain. Marta wanted more than that. She wanted a family that shared her values, a husband who respected her for who she was, not just for her last name. So, she had set her condition. She would marry into the Anderson family only if she could first observe them in their natural environment, without the mask that wealth often forced people to wear. Jean had been surprised by his daughter's request, but respected her wishes. He agreed to let her work undercover in the Anderson household, posing as a maid to see how they truly treated those beneath them. It had been a bold move, one that carried risks, but Marta had been determined to see it through. Now, after the incident with Clarissa, she knew her instincts had been correct. The Andersons, or at least Clarissa, were not the kind of people she wanted to tie her future to. Despite this, Marta remained undecided about Henry Anderson, the patriarch of the family. Unlike his wife, Henry had always seemed more detached, focused on his business ventures and financial empires. He wasn't a cruel man, not in the way Clarissa was, but there was an emotional distance about him that made Marta wary. She had observed him over the weeks she had spent in the mansion, noting how he rarely involved himself in the household's affairs. His indifference could be just as damning as Clarissa's cruelty, though in a different way. One evening, while the mansion was quiet and most of the guests had gone home, Marta found herself alone in the library. She had always been drawn to this room, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books, many of them first editions. It was one of the few places in the house where she felt at peace, away from the scrutiny of Clarissa and the watchful eyes of the other staff. As she scanned the shelves, her fingers brushing over the leather-bound volumes, she couldn't help but think about her father's teachings. He had always told her that a person's true character was revealed in moments of adversity, not in moments of comfort. It was during one of these quiet moments of reflection that Henry Anderson entered the room. He had been looking for a moment of solitude as well, unaware that Marta was there. When he saw her, there was a brief flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had been distant since the incident with Clarissa, though Marta had noticed the way he seemed to observe her from the corner of his eye. Now, standing in the library, with no guests or distractions, he seemed unsure of how to approach her. You're Marta, aren't you?" he finally asked, his voice cautious. Marta turned to face him, her expression calm. "Yes, Mr. Anderson, I am." There was an awkward silence as Henry shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being in situations where he didn't have the upper hand. In the business world, he was a titan, decisive, powerful, always in control. But here, in his own home, with this young woman who had just been revealed as the daughter of one of the most respected families in the city, he felt uncertain. I didn't know who you were," he admitted. "Clarissa, she can be difficult sometimes, but she didn't know either." Marta nodded slowly, not wanting to push him too far. She could see that Henry wasn't a bad man, but he was complicit in allowing Clarissa's behavior to go unchecked. That was something she couldn't ignore. "I understand, Mr. Anderson, but what happened the other night, it wasn't just about me. It was about how people in this house are treated." Henry looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't involve myself in the household affairs," he muttered, almost as if trying to justify his own detachment. "And maybe that's part of the problem," Marta said gently but firmly. "You build an empire, Mr. Anderson, but empires can crumble when the foundation is weak. The way people are treated here, it says more about this family than any business deal ever could." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Henry seemed to consider them. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not by someone who had been posing as a maid in his own home. But there was something about Marta, her poise, her calm certainty, that made him pause. "I'll talk to Clarissa," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. He wasn't a man used to challenging his wife, and Marta could see that, but it was a start. As Henry left the library, Marta felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't come to the Anderson household to cause chaos or disrupt their lives. She had come to learn, to observe, and to make a decision about her future. And now, with each passing day, that decision was becoming clearer. The Andersons were not the family she had hoped they would be, but there was still more to uncover, more layers to peel back before she could walk away with certainty. The mansion, with all its grandeur and luxury, had revealed its cracks. And Marta knew that those cracks ran deeper than just Clarissa's cruelty. There was a rot at the core of the family, one that Henry's indifference had allowed to fester. She couldn't change them, but she could choose whether or not to become a part of it. And that choice, though difficult, was becoming easier with every moment she spent in the mansion. Days passed after the fateful evening when Marta's true identity was unveiled, but the atmosphere in the Anderson household had not yet settled. The tension was palpable, and Henry Anderson, the man at the center of it all, found himself at a crossroads he had never expected to face. Henry had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, his businesses, his wealth, and even his household. Yet now, for the first time in years, he felt powerless. Clarissa's behavior had shaken him to the core, but what disturbed him most was his own complicity in it all. Marta's words had resonated with him, and try as he might, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had exposed a fundamental truth about his life. Henry had always viewed his wealth as a sign of success, as a validation of his hard work and determination. He had grown up with very little and had built his empire from the ground up, so it made sense to him that money equaled power and power equaled control. But now, as he walked through the grand halls of his mansion, he began to wonder if he had been blind to something far more important. Marta's revelation had been a jarring wake-up call, and though she had not accused him directly, her words had hit their mark. The Anderson name had become synonymous with wealth, but what about honor? What about dignity? Clarissa, meanwhile, had retreated into her own world, still fuming from the humiliation she had suffered. She had always been the queen of the social scene, the one everyone envied for her style, beauty, and sharp wit. But that night, in front of all their guests, her power had slipped through her fingers. The moment Richard had greeted Marta with respect, everything Clarissa had built her life around had begun to crumble. She wasn't used to losing, and the sting of defeat had left her seething in silence. Yet, even as she clung to her pride, she knew that something had fundamentally shifted in the house. Her grip on the family and on Henry was weakening, and she could feel it. As for Henry, he found himself alone in his thoughts more often than not, trying to piece together what had gone so wrong. He knew that Clarissa's harshness toward the staff had always been there, but he had ignored it, choosing instead to focus on his work and the endless pursuit of wealth. He had left the running of the household to her, and in doing so, had allowed her cruelty to fester unchecked. Now, confronted with the reality of who Marta truly was, he couldn't help but feel ashamed. She had come to his home to judge their character, to see if the Anderson family was worthy of her hand in marriage. And now it was clear they had failed her test. One afternoon, as Henry sat in his study, staring at the rows of financial reports that no longer seemed to matter, a knock came at the door. He looked up, expecting to see one of the servants, but instead, Marta stepped in. She moved with the same grace and dignity that had marked her from the moment she entered the mansion, but now there was something different about her. She was no longer hiding behind the role of a maid. She stood before him as an equal, her eyes calm yet firm. "Mr. Anderson," she began, her voice steady, "I wanted to speak with you. I think it's time we discuss the situation between our families." Henry's heart sank. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing full well that Marta had every right to walk away from the arranged marriage her father had proposed. How could he convince her otherwise? What could he possibly say after what had happened? "Of course," Henry replied, gesturing to a chair across from him. "Please sit." Marta took the seat, her posture straight and confident. She had spent weeks observing the Anderson family, and she had seen enough to know that while Henry was not like his wife, he had still allowed her behavior to go unchallenged. Yet, despite this, Marta could see a glimmer of something in Henry that gave her pause. He wasn't a bad man. He was simply disconnected, too focused on his empire to notice what was happening around him. But that didn't excuse his indifference. "I won't sugarcoat it, Mr. Anderson," Marta said, her tone direct but not unkind. "The way I was treated by your wife, it's unacceptable. And it's not just about me. I've seen how she treats the other staff members, and it's clear that this is not a one-time incident. This is a pattern of behavior." Henry nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he admitted. "I've been blind to it for too long, but now I see it." Marta leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Seeing it is one thing. Doing something about it is another. I didn't come here just to expose your wife's cruelty, Mr. Anderson. I came here because I wanted to know if your family was one that valued honor and respect. I wanted to see if this was a family I could join, a family I could be proud to be a part of." Henry felt the weight of her words, like a heavy stone in his chest. He had built his life around wealth and power, but now he realized that those things meant nothing without integrity. Marta was offering him a chance, not just to salvage the arrangement between their families, but to change the very foundation of his life. "You're right," Henry said quietly. "I've let things get out of hand. I've let Clarissa's behavior go unchecked, and I've been so focused on my work that I didn't see the damage it was causing. But I want to make it right. I need to make it right." Marta studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. She could see that Henry was a man who had lost sight of what truly mattered. But she also saw the potential for change. Perhaps there was still hope for the Anderson family after all. "Mr. Anderson," Marta said finally, "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for effort. If you're willing to change, if you're willing to stand up to your wife and address the way this household is run, then maybe there's a future for our families." Henry's heart lifted at her words, but he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Clarissa would not take kindly to being confronted, and there was no telling how she would react to the changes he needed to make. But for the first time in a long while, Henry felt a sense of clarity. He had allowed himself to be consumed by the superficial trappings of wealth. But now he saw that true success came from something much deeper. "I promise you," Henry said, his voice filled with conviction, "I will make things right, not just for you, but for everyone in this household." Marta nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I hope so, Mr. Anderson. I truly do." As she stood to leave, Henry couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her. Marta had shown him a truth he had been too blind to see, and now it was up to him to act on it. But as she walked toward the door, another thought crossed his mind, a thought that had been lingering since the night of the confrontation. "Marta," Henry called out before she could leave, "there's something I need to ask you." She turned to face him, her brow raised in curiosity. "Why did you agree to this marriage arrangement in the first place? You're a woman of wealth and status. You could have had anyone. Why us?" Marta smiled faintly, as if the answer were both simple and complex. "I agreed because my father believed in tradition, and I wanted to honor his wishes. But more than that, I wanted to know if wealth and power could coexist with honor and decency. I wanted to see if there was still hope for families like ours. Now I have my answer." With that, she turned and left the study, leaving Henry to ponder her words. The path ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long time, Henry felt a sense of purpose beyond his business empire. He knew now that he had a chance to rebuild not just his family's reputation, but the very core of who they were. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. The shift within the Anderson mansion was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying attention. Yet, to those who lived and worked within its grand walls, the change was undeniable. Henry Anderson, for the first time in years, had begun to assert himself in ways that few had ever expected. He had always been the quiet authority in the background, the business tycoon who left the affairs of the household to his wife, Clarissa. But now, following his conversation with Marta, something had awakened inside him. The realization that his wealth and success meant nothing if built upon a foundation of cruelty and indifference had shaken him to his core. Clarissa, however, had noticed this shift almost immediately. Her husband, who had once been content to let her run the household with an iron fist, was beginning to challenge her in ways that were unfamiliar and uncomfortable. It wasn't just his tone or his actions. It was the look in his eyes, the quiet determination that had replaced the detached gaze she had grown used to. Clarissa had always been the queen of her domain, reigning over the staff and social circle with ruthless precision. But now, Henry's newfound resolve was disrupting the balance of power within the house, and she didn't like it one bit. For Henry, the challenge of confronting Clarissa was daunting. He had spent years turning a blind eye to her behavior, choosing instead to focus on his business empire. But Marta's words had stuck with him, reverberating in his mind long after their conversation had ended. She had asked for effort, not perfection, and Henry was determined to give it. Yet deep down, he knew that confronting Clarissa would not be easy. She was not the type of woman to yield without a fight, and Henry braced himself for the battle that was sure to come. The first confrontation came during a quiet evening at home. The mansion was unusually calm, with most of the staff retired for the night and the guests long gone. Henry had been reviewing some papers in his study when Clarissa entered, her footsteps deliberate as she made her way across the room. She was dressed impeccably as always, her hair and makeup flawless even at this late hour. But there was an edge to her movements, a tension in the air that Henry could feel before she even spoke. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold and clipped. Henry set down his papers and looked up at her, already sensing where this conversation was headed. "About what?" Clarissa crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb with me, Henry. You've been different lately. Ever since that girl exposed herself as some kind of heiress, you've been acting like a different man." Henry resisted the urge to sigh. This was exactly what he had anticipated. A confrontation where Clarissa would frame herself as the victim, refusing to acknowledge the part she had played in the household's toxicity. But Henry knew he couldn't back down now, not after everything that had happened. "You're right," Henry said calmly. "I have been different because I've realized that things in this house need to change." Clarissa's eyes widened, and for a moment, her mask of control slipped. "Change?" she repeated, incredulous. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Henry began, choosing his words carefully, "that I've allowed you to treat people in ways that are unacceptable. The staff, Marta, even me, Clarissa. I've let it go on for too long, and I'm not going to ignore it anymore." Clarissa's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "So, what? You're taking her side now? That little actress who pretended to be a maid? She fooled all of us, Henry, and you're just going to let her waltz in here and tear our family apart." Henry shook his head. "This isn't about sides, Clarissa. This is about doing what's right. Marta didn't come here to destroy us. She came here to see if we were worthy of her respect. And so far, we've failed her." Clarissa laughed bitterly, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Oh, so now we're the ones who need to earn her respect? Is that it? Since when do we answer to the likes of her? Since she showed us what true honor looks like," Henry replied, his tone firm. "We've been living in a bubble, Clarissa. We've surrounded ourselves with wealth and status, but we've lost sight of what really matters. Marta came here with her eyes wide open, and she saw us for what we really are." Clarissa's face flushed with anger. She was not used to being challenged, especially not by her own husband. For years, she had maintained control over the household with an iron will, and now, that control was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't believe that Henry, the man who had always supported her, was turning against her in favor of a woman they barely knew. "You're being ridiculous," she snapped. "This is all because of that girl. You're letting her manipulate you, Henry. Don't you see? She's playing us, and you're falling for it." But Henry didn't waver. He had spent too many years ignoring the truth, and now that it was staring him in the face, he couldn't look away. "No, Clarissa, I'm not being manipulated. I'm finally seeing things clearly." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was thick, and Clarissa's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and fear. She had always prided herself on her ability to control any situation, but now, for the first time, she felt that control slipping away. Henry, the man she had always been able to depend on, was no longer willing to stand by her side unquestioningly, and that terrified her. "So, what are you going to do?" Clarissa asked, her voice low and dangerous. "Are you going to tear this family apart because of some noble notion of honor?" "I'm going to make things right," Henry said simply, "starting with how we treat the people in this house. That includes Marta, the staff, and everyone else who has been on the receiving end of your cruelty." Clarissa's eyes narrowed into slits, and for a moment, Henry wondered if she would lash out. But instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the hall as she left. Henry watched her go, feeling both relieved and uneasy. He knew this was far from over. Clarissa was not the type of woman to let things go easily, and he braced himself for whatever retaliation she might have in store. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the mansion grew even more tense. Clarissa remained cold and distant, avoiding Henry as much as possible and treating the staff with even more disdain than usual. It was clear that she was determined to assert her control in any way she could, but Henry was equally determined to stand his ground. He began making small changes around the household, speaking to the staff directly and ensuring that they were treated with respect and fairness. It wasn't easy. Many of them were still wary of Clarissa's wrath, but slowly, they began to see that Henry was sincere in his efforts. Marta, meanwhile, continued to observe from the sidelines. She could see the battle brewing between Henry and Clarissa, and though she appreciated Henry's attempts to change, she knew that the real test was yet to come. Clarissa was not a woman who gave up easily, and Marta suspected that she was already plotting her next move. One evening, as Marta was finishing up some paperwork in her room, she received a message from her father. It was brief, but it carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. "Marta, it's time to make your decision. The Anderson family's future rests in your hands." The words sent a chill down her spine. She had come to the Anderson household with the intention of making a decision about her future, and now that moment had arrived. But even as she contemplated her next steps, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. Henry had shown a willingness to change, but was it enough? Could the Anderson family truly transform, or was it too late? The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Henry continued his efforts to reform the household, while Clarissa grew increasingly isolated and angry. The staff watched the silent battle unfold, unsure of where it would lead. And Marta, caught in the middle, knew that the time had come to make a choice that would change everything. The Anderson mansion was once again the scene of a grand event. Henry had arranged an exclusive dinner party for a select group of high-profile investors, hoping to secure new business deals that would further expand his already vast empire. The dinner was meant to be a showcase of his wealth and influence, but under the surface, there was a palpable tension that everyone felt. The events of the past few weeks had left the household in disarray, and though Henry had made efforts to restore order and instill a new sense of respect within the mansion, the unresolved conflict between him and Clarissa lingered like a dark cloud over the evening. Marta, despite her growing internal conflict, remained in the mansion as a silent observer. She had yet to make her final decision about her future with the Anderson family, but she had agreed to attend the dinner in her role as part of the staff. She would serve the guests just as she had done before, but this time, the stakes were much higher. Her father had made it clear in his last message. The time to decide had come. Yet, even with that looming over her, Marta knew that tonight would bring revelations of its own. The Anderson family's true nature was about to be laid bare once again, and this time, there would be no hiding from the truth. As the guests arrived, Clarissa greeted them with her usual elegance and charm. Her icy demeanor had melted away for the evening, replaced by a mask of sophistication that she had perfected over the years. She played the role of the gracious hostess flawlessly, and most of the guests were none the wiser to the turmoil that had unfolded behind closed doors. But Marta, watching from the sidelines, could see through the act. Clarissa was still seething with resentment over Henry's recent actions, and Marta could sense that the evening would not end without some sort of confrontation. Henry, on the other hand, was calm but focused. He knew that tonight was critical for his business, but his mind was also preoccupied with the ongoing tension in his marriage. He had tried to reason with Clarissa to make her see the need for change, but she had refused to listen. Now, as he mingled with the guests and made small talk, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything hanging over him. Tonight, he would have to juggle the demands of his business and the cracks in his personal life, all while keeping up appearances for the sake of his reputation. The dinner itself was a grand affair, with multiple courses prepared by the best chefs in the city. The table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and silverware that sparkled under the chandelier's light. The room was filled with the hum of polite conversation and the clinking of glasses, but beneath the surface, there was a tension that seemed to grow with each passing minute. Clarissa played her part well, but Marta could see the way her eyes narrowed whenever Henry spoke to one of the guests. It was as if she were waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to reclaim the control she had lost. As the main course was served, Marta moved gracefully between the guests, refilling drinks and ensuring that everything was in order. She had spent weeks in this role, quietly observing the dynamics of the Anderson family and the people they associated with. Tonight, however, she felt an added pressure. Every movement, every glance, seemed loaded with significance. She knew that tonight would be pivotal in her decision-making process, and she was prepared for whatever might come. It wasn't until dessert was served that the first cracks in the facade began to show. One of the guests, an investor named Edward Hastings, began a conversation that quickly veered into dangerous territory. He had been discussing his admiration for Henry's business acumen when he casually mentioned something that caught Clarissa's attention. "I've heard whispers about a partnership between the Anderson family and the Duvalier family," Hastings said, his voice low but clear. "That would be quite the alliance, wouldn't it?" The room fell silent for a moment as the guests looked to Henry for a response. Henry's expression remained neutral, but Marta could see the tension in his posture. He had not expected the topic of her family to come up, at least not in this setting. Clarissa, however, seized the moment. "Oh, I wouldn't put too much stock in rumors, Edward," she said with a sharp smile. "The Duvalier are, well, they're quite different from us." Her words were carefully chosen, but Marta could hear the underlying disdain in her tone. Clarissa had always viewed her family's wealth and power as a tool for dominance, and the idea of aligning with another powerful family had always been a matter of strategy for her. But she had never truly respected the Duvalier, seeing them as competitors rather than equals. Hastings raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her response. "Is that so? I've always heard that the Duvalier are one of the most honorable families in the city." At that moment, Marta felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Though she was standing at the edge of the room, it was clear that the conversation was inching closer to her true identity. Clarissa, sensing the shift in the room's energy, turned her gaze toward Marta, her expression unreadable. "Yes, well," Clarissa said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Honor is a fine thing, but in the world of business, it's power that truly matters, isn't it?" The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Marta knew that this was her moment to speak. She could remain silent, continuing to play the role of the humble maid, or she could step forward and reveal the truth. It was a choice she had been grappling with for weeks, and now, in the heat of the moment, the decision seemed clearer than ever. "I disagree, Mrs. Anderson," Marta said, her voice calm but firm. The entire room turned to look at her, the surprise evident on their faces. Marta took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Clarissa's. "In my experience, true power comes from integrity and respect. Without those, all the wealth in the world means nothing." The room was silent, Even Henry, who had been trying to manage the situation from a distance, looked at Marta with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. Clarissa, however, was livid. She had spent years building her empire on the backs of others, using her wealth and influence to control those around her. And now, in front of their most important guests, a mere maid was challenging her authority. Clarissa rose from her seat, her eyes blazing with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You're nothing but a servant in this house. You don't get to lecture me on power." Marta remained composed, her expression steady. She had expected this reaction, and she was ready for it. "I'm more than just a servant, Mrs. Anderson," she said quietly. "Versnoit sedvov. My family has built its reputation on the very values you dismiss so easily." The guests gasped, the realization of Marta's true identity dawning on them. Clarissa, for the first time that evening, looked genuinely shocked. She had always known that Marta was different from the other staff, but she had never suspected that she was the daughter of the very family they had been discussing. You're, Clarissa stammered, unable to find the words. "Yes," Marta said, her voice unwavering. "I'm the daughter of the Duvalier family, and I came here to see if the Andersons were worthy of an alliance with us. What I've seen so far has been disappointing." Clarissa's face flushed with humiliation, her hands clenching at her sides. The guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to react. Henry, for his part, remained silent, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had just happened. He had known that Marta was from a wealthy family, but seeing her stand before Clarissa, challenging her in front of everyone, was something he hadn't anticipated. The silence in the room was deafening, and it was clear that the evening had taken a turn that no one had expected. Clarissa, for the first time in her life, was speechless. The power she had wielded so effortlessly for years had been stripped away in an instant, and there was nothing she could do to regain it. Marta, having said her piece, turned and left the room, leaving the Anderson family and their guests to grapple with the fallout of the evening's revelations. As she walked through the grand halls of the mansion, she knew that her time here was coming to an end. The decision she had been struggling with for weeks had finally been made. The Anderson family, despite Henry's efforts, had shown their true colors. And now, Marta knew what she had to do. The revelation of Marta Duvalier's true identity sent shockwaves through the Anderson household. The silence that had enveloped the dinner party after Marta's bold declaration still echoed in the grand halls of the mansion. Guests had left in a dazed hush, their polite farewells carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. The Anderson name, once synonymous with unshakable power and influence, had been tarnished in a single evening, and at the center of it all stood Clarissa, stripped of her carefully constructed image of control and elegance. Clarissa had always been the queen of her world, ruling over the Anderson empire with a sharp tongue and an even sharper wit. But now, in the aftermath of Marta's public confrontation, she felt as though the ground beneath her had crumbled. She had been humiliated, and not just in front of her husband or the staff, but in front of the most important figures in their social and business circles. The people she had spent years impressing and manipulating had seen her reduced to a stammering, powerless figure, and the shame burned deep within her. As the hours passed after the dinner, Clarissa retreated to her private quarters, refusing to speak to anyone. Not even Henry, who had long since grown accustomed to her icy silence, dared to approach her. He had watched the events unfold with a mixture of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. Though he hadn't wanted things to unravel in such a dramatic way, there was a part of him that felt Marta had done what he could not. She had exposed the truth about Clarissa's cruelty and arrogance, and now there was no going back. But Clarissa, alone in her room, wasn't ready to admit defeat. She paced the floor, her mind racing as she replayed the evening's events over and over in her head. How had this happened? How had she, Clarissa Anderson, been outmaneuvered by a girl who had posed as a maid in her own home? The thought made her blood boil. Marta's deception felt like a personal attack, a deliberate attempt to destroy everything Clarissa had built. She couldn't let it stand. Clarissa knew she had to act, But what could she do? Marta had exposed her, not just as a harsh and domineering wife, but as a woman who lacked the very qualities that people of their status were supposed to uphold: grace, dignity, respect. She had spent years maintaining the facade of a perfect, powerful matriarch, but now that mask had been shattered, the guests who had witnessed the confrontation would not forget what they had seen. Clarissa's reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins. Still, there was one thing Clarissa had always prided herself on: her ability to survive. She had clawed her way to the top, marrying Henry not for love, but for the power and status their union would bring. And she wasn't about to let it all slip away because of one embarrassing evening. No! Clarissa had no intention of bowing to Marta or anyone else. She would find a way to regain control, no matter what it took. The next morning, as the sunlight streamed through the windows of her bedroom, Clarissa made her decision. She would confront Henry, but on her own terms. She had to regain her position within the household to remind him and everyone else who was truly in charge. After all, Henry had always been the one focused on business, leaving the management of their social affairs to her. He needed her, whether he admitted it or not. When Clarissa finally descended from her quarters, she found Henry in his study, his face weary but resolute. He had been expecting her to approach him eventually, though he had no idea what her strategy would be. He knew Clarissa well enough to understand that she would never simply admit defeat. There was always a plan, always a calculation. "Henry," Clarissa began, her voice calm but edged with steel. "We need to talk." Henry looked up from his desk, meeting her gaze with a level of detachment that was new for him. The dynamic between them had shifted in recent weeks, and he knew that this conversation would be a turning point. "I agree," he said quietly. "We do." Clarissa took a seat across from him, her back straight, her posture rigid. She had always been good at masking her emotions, but tonight had left her more vulnerable than she cared to admit. "Last night was unfortunate," she said carefully, "but it doesn't change the fact that we have built something together, something that is too important to let fall apart because of a girl who thinks she can lecture us about morality." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, his patience wearing thin. "Clarissa, this isn't about Marta trying to lecture us. This is about you and how you've treated the people in this house. Last night was the result of years of behavior that you've refused to acknowledge. And now, it's come back to haunt us." Clarissa's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Henry, don't be naive. We're in a world where power is everything. You know that as well as I do. We can't afford to let sentimentality or misplaced ideals get in the way of what we've built." Henry shook his head, a sigh escaping his lips. "What we've built? Clarissa, do you even hear yourself? You're talking about our family as if it's just another business deal. That's the problem. You've lost sight of what really matters." Clarissa's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare lecture me about what matters. I've done everything for this family. I've kept up appearances, maintained our status, built our social network, all while you've been buried in your work. Do you think any of those people would care about your business success if it weren't for the image I've cultivated for us?" Henry stood up from his chair, his frustration finally breaking through. "And what has that image cost us, Clarissa? How many people have you trampled on to keep up that facade? Last night, you were exposed for what you really are: cruel, arrogant, and heartless. And if you don't change, this family is going to fall apart." Clarissa rose to her feet as well, her fists clenched at her sides. "I'm not going to let some girl who doesn't understand the world we live in destroy everything I've worked for. I refuse to let her win. This isn't about winning or losing, Clarissa." Henry's voice rose, the anger in his chest finally erupting. "This is about being decent human beings. Marta saw something in us, something you've refused to see. And if you can't admit that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't understand the world anymore." Clarissa stared at him, her face pale with fury. She had never seen Henry like this, so resolute, so unwilling to bend to her will. It terrified her, not because she feared losing him, but because she feared losing the power she had so carefully cultivated. But she couldn't back down now. She wouldn't. "I'm going to fix this," Clarissa said, her voice cold and firm. "I don't care what it takes. I'm not going to let our family fall apart because of a maid who thinks she can play at being our equal." Henry shook his head, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "If that's what you believe, Clarissa, then I don't know if there's anything left to save." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Clarissa standing there, her chest heaving with rage. She had always believed that power was the only thing that mattered, but now, for the first time, she felt something slipping away, something more important than she had ever realized. The next few days were a blur of tension and silence in the mansion. Clarissa kept to herself, plotting her next move, while Henry withdrew further into his work, clearly exhausted by the strain of it all. The staff, though aware of the conflict, avoided getting involved, though they couldn't help but notice the shift in the household's atmosphere. Marta, meanwhile, had remained quiet since the dinner party, her decision still weighing heavily on her mind. But even as Clarissa stewed in her anger, something had changed. The power she had once wielded so effortlessly was no longer enough. The Anderson family was crumbling, not because of Marta, but because of her refusal to change. And deep down, Clarissa knew that no amount of scheming or plotting could fix what had been broken. The days following the dinner party were marked by a tense and heavy silence that lingered throughout the Anderson mansion. The once bustling estate now felt like a shell of its former self, as if the very walls were waiting for something inevitable to occur. Henry had immersed himself fully into his work, spending long hours in his study, avoiding Clarissa and the confrontations that had become all too frequent between them. Clarissa, on the other hand, had retreated into herself, rarely leaving her quarters, except when absolutely necessary. The staff, though professional, moved cautiously through the mansion, aware that the household was teetering on the edge of something they couldn't fully understand. Marta, too, felt the weight of the tension, but unlike Clarissa and Henry, her time in the mansion was coming to a close. The decision she had been grappling with for so long had finally solidified in her mind. She had seen all she needed to see, and now there was only one thing left to do. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "The Anderson family's future rests in your hands." She hadn't fully understood the gravity of that statement when he had first said it, but now it was clear. Her decision would shape the course of both families, and Marta knew that it was a responsibility she couldn't take lightly. One morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Marta made her way to Henry's study. She knew that he would be there, just as he had been every day since the dinner party. She knocked gently on the door before entering, and as she stepped inside, she found Henry seated at his desk, staring out of the large window that overlooked the estate's vast gardens. His face was lined with exhaustion, and there was a weight in his eyes that Marta hadn't seen before. He had always been a man of quiet strength, but now he looked as if the burden of the past weeks had finally caught up with him. "Mr. Anderson," Marta began softly, closing the door behind her, "I think it's time we talked." Henry turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He nodded slowly, gesturing for her to take a seat across from him. Marta sat down, folding her hands in her lap as she gathered her thoughts. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind many times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt heavier than she had anticipated. "I've made my decision," Marta said finally, her voice steady, "and I think you deserve to know what it is." Henry's gaze remained fixed on her, but he didn't interrupt. He had known this moment was coming, though he hadn't been sure what to expect. After everything that had happened, he couldn't blame Marta if she chose to walk away from the Anderson family entirely. "You asked me once why I agreed to this arrangement in the first place," Marta continued, "and I told you that it was because of my father, because of the tradition between our families. But it was more than that. I wanted to believe that there was something good here, something worth holding on to." She paused, her eyes meeting Henry's. "I came here to see if your family shared the values that I was raised with: honor, respect, and integrity." And I wanted to know if those values could survive in a world as complicated as the one we live in. Henry's shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of his failures had settled more deeply on him. "And what did you find?" he asked quietly. Marta took a deep breath. "I found that those values do exist here, but they've been buried beneath layers of ambition, pride, and arrogance. Your wife, she's lost sight of what truly matters. And because of that, this family is suffering. But you, Henry, you've shown me that there is still hope. You've tried to change, to make things right. And that's not something I take lightly." Henry looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes, though he remained cautious. "But is it enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marta hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know if it's enough. That's something only time will tell. But what I do know is that you're willing to try, and that gives me hope." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions. Henry's mind raced as he considered what Marta's words meant for the future. He had been so focused on the immediate challenges, on the collapse of his marriage, on the tension in his household, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about what came next. But now, with Marta sitting in front of him, he realized that there was still a chance to rebuild, to start again. "I don't want to leave things the way they are," Marta said softly. "I don't want to walk away from this family knowing that there was something more we could have done. But that's not a decision I can make alone." Henry nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "And Clarissa?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Marta's expression softened, but there was no mistaking the firmness in her voice. "Clarissa is part of the problem, not the solution. She's not willing to change, and until she is, there will always be this darkness hanging over your family. I can't be part of that." Henry lowered his gaze, the truth of her words sinking in. He had known for some time that his marriage to Clarissa was beyond saving, but hearing Marta say it out loud made it all the more real. His relationship with Clarissa had always been one of convenience, built on wealth and social standing rather than love. But now, after everything that had happened, he couldn't ignore the damage that Clarissa's arrogance had caused. "I understand," Henry said quietly. "I've known for a while that things with Clarissa couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know how to stop it." Marta gave him a small, understanding smile. "Sometimes, the hardest part of moving forward is letting go of what's holding you back." Henry looked up at her, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. He had spent years holding on to the image of his family, of his marriage, as something unshakable, something that would endure no matter what. But now, he realized that in order to build something new, he had to let go of the old. "What are you going to do?" Marta asked gently, her eyes filled with compassion. Henry was silent for a moment, his mind racing through the possibilities. He knew what he needed to do, but the thought of taking that step filled him with a deep sense of sadness and loss. Yet at the same time, there was a strange sense of relief. He had spent so long trying to hold everything together, but now, for the first time, he could see a path forward, one that didn't involve the constant struggle for control and dominance. "I'm going to make things right," Henry said finally, his voice filled with quiet determination. "With or without Clarissa." Marta nodded, her expression one of quiet approval. "That's all anyone can ask for." As she rose from her seat, Henry stood as well, watching her as she moved toward the door. There was a sense of finality in the air, but it wasn't the kind of ending that brought despair. It was the kind of ending that made way for something new, something better. "Marta," Henry called after her just as she reached the door. She turned, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Yes, thank you," he said simply. Marta smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "You're welcome, Henry. I hope you find what you're looking for." With that, she left the room, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. The mansion was quiet once more, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the past few weeks. It was a kind of silence that signaled a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to start again. And Henry knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. Enjoy the story, Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.